The Texas heat shimmered like a furnace as Thad Morrison limped through the mesquite and prickly pear, his left leg twisted and useless, his surveyor's compass smashed beyond repair. At 55, the former territorial land commissioner had mapped thousands of acres across the frontier, settled countless boundary disputes, and spent 26 years bringing order to the chaos of westward expansion. But he'd never expected to be crippled and left for dead by his own deputy, betrayed for the crime of refusing to falsify homestead claims that would steal water rights from struggling Mexican families. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the landscape into a wavering mirage of heat and dust. Thad's throat burned with thirst, his cracked lips bleeding as he dragged himself forward inch by painful inch. His once pristine white shirt was now stained with dirt and blood, torn in places where the mesquite thorns had caught and ripped the fabric. The gold pocket watch his father had given him upon his appointment as commissioner lay broken in his pocket, its hands frozen at the moment of his betrayal. "You're too honest for territorial politics, Commissioner," Deputy Marshal Hawkins had snarled as his hired thugs worked Thad over with fence posts and iron bars. "This territory's got no use for officials who can't tell the difference between law and profit." Hawkins's face had been twisted with contempt, his handlebar mustache quivering with each word. The deputy had always been ambitious, always looking for angles. But Thad had never suspected the depths of his corruption until he discovered the altered land records. The profit had been Hawkins's scheme to invalidate legitimate Mexican land grants through forged surveys and backdated claims, allowing wealthy Anglo ranchers to seize prime water sources along the Rio Grande. When Thad discovered the conspiracy and refused to sign the fraudulent documents, Hawkins had decided that a tragic riding accident would solve his problem permanently. Should have stuck to drawing maps instead of drawing lines in the sand. Hawkins had laughed as they loaded Thad onto a buckboard and dumped him in the thorny wasteland. "Maybe the rattlesnakes will teach you about territorial justice." The memory of Hawkins's laughter echoed in Thad's mind as he crawled forward. The beating had been methodical, professional almost. They'd known exactly how to inflict maximum damage without killing him outright. His ribs ached with each breath, and his left eye was swollen shut. The worst damage had been to his leg, deliberately shattered with repeated blows from an iron bar. Even if he survived, he'd never walk properly again. Now Thad crawled through the catclaw and cenizo, his shattered leg dragging behind him, his vision blurred from pain and the merciless sun. Each movement sent spikes of agony through his body, but the alternative was to lie down and die in this God-forsaken wilderness. In the distance, he spotted adobe buildings clustered around a windmill, the first sign of civilization he'd seen since crawling away from Hawkins's brutality. The sight gave him renewed strength. He'd been a surveyor before becoming commissioner, had spent years in the wilderness with nothing but his instruments and his wits. He knew how to read the land, how to find water in seemingly barren places. The adobe structures weren't a mirage. They represented his only chance at survival. The ranch sat in a natural depression, where underground springs fed a small oasis of green in the endless brown of South Texas. A few scraggly cottonwoods provided precious shade, their leaves rustling in the hot breeze. Chickens scratched in the dust, and a mule brayed somewhere in the distance. Thad collapsed at the well, his blood mixing with the precious water that meant life or death in this harsh country. The woman drawing water looked up at his approach, small but strong, with graying black hair braided with silver ribbons, her weathered face marking her as someone who'd spent years fighting the desert sun. She wore practical clothes with Mexican embroidery, and her dark eyes held the fierce determination of someone who'd learned to defend what was hers. A silver crucifix hung at her neck, catching the sunlight as she moved. "Dios santo!" she exclaimed, dropping her bucket and rushing to his side. "What happened to you, senor?" Her voice carried the musical cadence of the border, Spanish and English blending together in the distinctive accent of someone who'd lived her life between two worlds. Despite her small stature, her hands were strong and calloused from years of hard work. "Deputy Marshal," Thad gasped through cracked lips. "My own deputy tried to kill me." The confession took the last of his strength, and darkness closed in around him. The last thing he remembered was the woman calling for help, her voice fading as consciousness slipped away. The woman, he'd later learn her name was Esperanza S.B. Delgado, helped him toward her house with surprising strength for someone so small. Her home was modest, but well-maintained, with thick adobe walls that kept out the heat and furnishings that spoke of someone who took pride in what little she owned. When Thad regained consciousness, he found himself lying on a narrow bed, clean bandages wrapped around his wounds. The room was cool and dark, the thick adobe walls insulating against the brutal heat outside. A small window let in just enough light to see by, and the air smelled of herbs and clean linen. "Your own deputy did this to your leg?" she asked, examining the damage with hands that moved with gentle competence. She had cleaned the wound and set the bone as best she could, but even Thad could see that the damage was severe. "Caught him, stealing land grants, didn't appreciate my interference." SB's expression hardened with recognition. She'd seen this kind of beating before, the systematic brutality of men who used badges to justify their theft. "Cabrones," she muttered. "Bastards who steal from families who have nothing." Her anger wasn't the hot, explosive kind that burned itself out quickly. It was the cold, enduring rage of someone who had witnessed injustice too many times and refused to become numb to it. She worked methodically, cleaning his wounds and applying poultices made from desert plants known for their healing properties. For 6 weeks, Thad lay helpless while SB tended his wounds with a mixture of frontier medicine and traditional remedies her grandmother had taught her. She used prickly pear to reduce inflammation, creosote for infection, and willow bark for pain. His leg would never be straight again, the bones had healed crooked. But she managed to save it from amputation and restore enough function for him to walk with a cane. During those long weeks of recovery, Thad learned about the woman who had saved his life. SB spoke little of herself at first, focusing instead on his healing. But gradually, as he regained strength, she began to share pieces of her story during the quiet evenings when the desert cooled and stars filled the sky. She had been born in this very house, the daughter of a Mexican mother and a Tejano father who had fought with Sam Houston. Her childhood had been spent learning both cultures, her mother's traditional ways and her father's American ambitions. She had married young to a vaquero named Miguel Delgado, a skilled horseman who had taught her to ride and shoot. When Thad finally sat up clear-headed, he found SB working at a small desk, carefully copying legal documents in both Spanish and English. Her handwriting was precise and elegant, and she worked with the concentration of someone who understood that paperwork could mean the difference between keeping her land and losing everything. "You read law," he observed, watching her work. The realization surprised him. Educated women were rare enough on the frontier, but a Mexican woman with legal knowledge was almost unheard of. "I read whatever I need to survive," SB replied, not looking up from her copying. "English, Spanish, legal documents. Out here, you learn to understand the words that can destroy you." She dipped her pen in the inkwell, the movement practiced and precise. The document before her was a land deed, the Spanish text carefully translated into English on the facing page. Thad recognized the format immediately. It was a Mexican land grant from before Texas independence, the kind that was increasingly being challenged by Anglo settlers. Her story emerged slowly. SB was the widow of a vaquero who'd been murdered by Anglo settlers seeking to steal their small ranch. Miguel had been shot in the back while checking their cattle, his body left for the vultures. Rather than flee or remarry for protection, she'd taught herself law and fought a dozen court battles to keep her land, using her late husband's military service record and her own fierce intelligence to outmaneuver men who thought a Mexican widow would be easy prey. "Men think I don't understand American law," she explained, organizing her papers with military precision. "They're wrong. I understand it better than most. I've had to use it to survive." She showed him the small library she had accumulated, law books, dictionaries, territorial statutes, and court decisions. Some were in English, others in Spanish, all well-worn from constant use. She had taught herself to navigate the complex legal system that was increasingly being used to dispossess her people of their ancestral lands. After Miguel died, they thought I would run back to Mexico, she said, her voice matter of fact. When I didn't, they tried to scare me away. When that didn't work, they tried to use the courts. I learned their game and beat them at it. Thad told her about Hawkins's conspiracy, the forged land grants, the years of honest service repaid with treachery. He described the systematic corruption he had uncovered, how Hawkins had been working with land speculators to invalidate Mexican land grants through technicalities and forged documents. The water rights were the real prize. Whoever controlled water in this arid land controlled everything. Espy listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if she'd heard similar stories before. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing as Thad described the network of corruption that reached from local officials all the way to the territorial capital. "This Deputy Hawkins," she said finally. "He thinks badges give him the right to steal? He thinks I'm a fool for believing in justice over profit. Too naive to understand that law is just another tool for taking what you want." "Maybe he's right about one thing," Espy said, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe the old way of enforcing law is finished. Question is, what are you going to build to replace it?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging and profound. Thad had spent his career believing in the system, in the idea that law could bring order to the chaos of the frontier. Now, broken and betrayed by that same system, he faced a choice: give up or find a new way to fight. Their partnership began when a group of Mexican families arrived seeking help with homestead claims that had been mysteriously lost by the Territorial Land Office. They came hesitantly at first, having heard rumors of the gringo staying with Espy, but their desperation overcame their caution. Without legal proof of their claims, they would lose everything. Thad's knowledge of surveying and territorial law, combined with Espy's understanding of Spanish land grants and local politics, allowed them to reconstruct the missing documents and protect the family's rights. Thad taught Espy the finer points of surveying, while she helped him understand the complex history of land ownership in the region. Together, they pored over maps and legal documents, reconstructing boundaries and establishing clear chains of title. Thad's reputation as an honest commissioner gave weight to their findings, while Espy's connections in the Mexican community provided access to witnesses and historical records that would otherwise have been inaccessible. "You still know your business?" Espy observed as they watched the families celebrate their restored claims. Children played in the dusty yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the fear that had marked their arrival. "No boundaries, no legal precedents, know how to read the signs when something's been falsified," Thad replied, leaning heavily on the walking stick Espy had carved for him from mesquite wood. "Out here, that's still worth something." Word spread through South Texas about the ranch at Scorpion Wells, where Espy Delgado and the Crippled Land Commissioner could resolve disputes that had stumped territorial courts for years. They developed a reputation for fairness that extended from San Antonio to the Mexican border. Ranchers and farmers, Anglos and Mexicans alike, began bringing their boundary disputes to Scorpion Wells, rather than the corrupt territorial courts. Thad and Espy charged fair fees for their services, enough to sustain themselves, but never so much that justice became unaffordable. They worked together seamlessly, each complementing the other's strengths. More importantly, they found in each other something they'd both thought lost: companionship, respect, and the slow-burning warmth of mature love built on shared struggles and mutual understanding. It wasn't the passionate romance of youth, but something deeper and more enduring. A partnership of equals who had each seen the worst of humanity and chosen to fight back, rather than surrender. The confrontation with Deputy Marshal Hawkins came 2 years later. He arrived with a territorial judge and forged warrants, claiming Thad was harboring fugitives and needed to be arrested for obstruction of justice. A cloud of dust announced their approach, a dozen riders coming hard across the desert toward Scorpion Wells. "There's the old cripple," Hawkins announced, pointing at his former superior. "Living in sin with some Mexican woman, probably helping bandits cross the border by now." His voice carried the same arrogant certainty that had marked their last encounter, but there was something new in it as well, a hint of desperation. Hawkins had grown wealthy from his schemes, but rumors of federal investigations had begun to circulate, and his once secure position was increasingly threatened. Thad stepped out of the ranch house, no longer the broken man Hawkins had left for dead. Hard work and purpose had strengthened his body, while finding his true calling had restored his spirit. He walked with a pronounced limp and needed his cane, but his voice was strong and his authority unquestionable. "Hawkins," he said calmly, "you're looking prosperous. The land-stealing business treating you well? Don't get smart with me, Morrison. You're under arrest for interfering with territorial business." "Interfering?" Espy stepped out beside Thad, a rifle cradled in her arms. "Funny thing about that. I sent some letters to friends in Austin and Washington. Seems the federal government's been investigating missing land records." Hawkins's confidence wavered as he realized they'd been building a case against him for months. Espy's connections throughout the Mexican-American community had provided access to witnesses and documents that painted a clear picture of systematic land fraud. "This is a setup," Hawkins sputtered, his hand moving toward his gun. "No," came a new voice from the mesquite. "This is justice." Captain Juan Seguin emerged from the brush with a dozen Texas Rangers, their badges gleaming in the desert sun. They'd been tracking Hawkins's conspiracy for over a year, following a trail of forged documents and stolen water rights across 3 counties. "You want to steal from Mexican families?" Seguin called out in perfect English. "Try stealing from Texas Rangers instead." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Hawkins's men were outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just angry Rangers but federal investigators who'd been building a case against territorial corruption. "This isn't over," Hawkins snarled, backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is," came another new voice. A federal marshal rode up to the ranch, flanked by territorial officials and several angry ranchers who'd discovered Hawkins's plan to steal their water rights as well. Hawkins's empire crumbled quickly once federal authorities began examining his records and interviewing witnesses. His conspiracy had reached far beyond Mexican land grants, involving systematic fraud that threatened the entire territorial land system. He died in federal prison 18 months later, still claiming he'd only been trying to develop Texas. "Feel better?" Espy asked as they watched the federal party disappear toward the horizon, taking Hawkins with them in chains. "Feel vindicated," Thad replied, leaning on his walking stick. "For the first time since they crippled me, I feel like justice actually means something again." Their partnership deepened into something more profound than business or convenience. They established a land office that served the entire region, providing surveying services, legal advice, and advocacy for anyone fighting to keep their rightful property. As the years passed, Scorpion Wells became known as a place where justice could be found regardless of one's background or wealth. Thad and Espy trained others in their methods, creating a network of honest surveyors and advocates who helped stem the tide of land theft that had characterized the early territorial days. "We make quite a team," Espy observed one evening as they sat by their well, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant reds and golds. The day's work was done, and they had earned this moment of peace. "We make a home," Thad corrected, taking her calloused hand in his scarred one. "The kind that's built on truth rather than theft, on justice rather than greed." At 57, Thaddeus Morrison was no longer the broken-down commissioner who'd been beaten and left for dead by a corrupt deputy. He was a defender of property rights, a protector of the innocent, and living proof that law was strongest when it served all people, rather than just the powerful. The desert that had nearly claimed his life had instead given him purpose, partnership, and the chance to practice law the way it was meant to be practiced, with integrity, fairness, and the understanding that justice delayed was justice denied. And Esperanza Delgado had found something she'd thought lost when her husband died. Not just love, but belonging with someone who saw her Mexican heritage as strength rather than weakness, who understood that building something lasting required both legal knowledge and the courage to stand up for what was right. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream in the harsh beauty of South Texas, proving that sometimes the people society discards become the ones who uphold its highest ideals. Their ranch became a landmark on the frontier, Scorpion Wells Land Office, where honest dealing and equal justice went hand in hand. The stagecoaches still ran past their gate, carrying mail and passengers across the expanding Southwest. But now they carried something else as well, the knowledge that there were still places where property rights mattered more than politics, where broken legs couldn't break an honest spirit, and where two people who'd been written off by the world proved that the strongest foundations are built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a fair chance to build their own piece of the American dream.